All my life I have been cooking and marinating with spirits. Today is a great day. I get to cook with a truly classic American spirit, bourbon. For this show, we traveled to Louisville, Kentucky to find out how bourbon is made. I also be preparing some bourbon-infused recipes, such as my bourbon-glazed shrimp bisque, pork tenderloin marinated in bourbon and pepper, red cabbage with bourbon-glazed apples, corn and bacon galette, and for the great finale, a bourbon pecan pie. All for the bite of bourbon and a taste of history. Wow, spectacular.
A taste of history is made possible by Sandals Resorts, the luxury included vacation.
When I first conceptualized the menu today for a taste of history, I used recipes that normally I would have used cognac. Being a European-trained chef, I obviously did not have the opportunity to cook with bourbon, since bourbon is expensive outside the United States. Bourbon, in my book, is much better than cognac. So for the first course, I'm doing a shrimp bisque or a cream of shrimp. But to make this and get the right flavor into it, I wanted to use the shells that I preserved from the shrimp, deglaze it and make a quick shrimp stock. You pull off the heads, you put off the tail, you take all the shells off and throw them in the bowl. And once you figure out how much you want to make, you just need to clean your shrimp and throw them right in our pot and deglaze them. Since a shrimp bisque is a very delicate soup, we are not using anything but butter. Get a hot pan, put some butter into it. Now we want to cook the shrimp, shells and heads until they're this color. You heard me say this a million times. If you cook with spirits, or any alcohol for that matter, you want to make sure you never pour it straight from the bottle. Why? Because if the bottle would ignite, you'd have a Molotov cocktail and you burn down your house or hurt yourself. So very, very important. So now that's deglazed, we're going to add white wine. We're going to add in some leeks and the onion. Just chop it coarse, and bay leaf. Perfect, look at that. See the color? It changes already. Amazing. Remember, when you make a stock, you want to put nothing in there that will discolor your stock. No carrots or tomato. Now I'm going to top it with water and let it boil away. The shrimp head are relatively thin, so they don't need a lot of time. Now I'm getting ready for the bourbon pepper marinated pork tenderloin, which you want to do overnight. You want the peppercorns to be kind of coarse. So I would have a mixed peppercorn here. Oh, the flavor of this peppercorn is unbelievable. I put this to the side. Any store you can find pork tenderloin comes just like that. What you want to do for this recipe, you want to cut the tail off. The reason for that is this would get way too cooked. So you just take a paring knife or any kind of knife and take down the silver skin as well. Just about like so. And now I got the bourbon ready. Not too much, just a little bit for the flavor. I have some oil, any kind of oil will work for that. So then I have the peppercorns. Some whole, look at that, how beautiful. Oh, and I just want to turn this over a little bit, and then I recommend you stick it in your refrigerator overnight so that the bourbon and the peppercorn can come together in harmony. Oh, God, I can smell the stock. Unbelievable. And look at the colorization already. It's so unbelievable to me, the amount of flavor that's buried in the head of the shrimp. Now is the time to strain it out into a separate pot. All right. So now I take shallots and I've chopped them really fine. The finer the better. And if you ever cook with shallots, you most likely will find out the difference between shallots and onion. It's the sweetness of the shallot. So all I'm going to do is take a nice piece of butter, make sure the butter melts. All right, put the shallots in. Remember, I don't want any color in there. So we're going to deglaze our shallots. Perfect. And now we're adding in the shrimp stock. I almost cut myself on fire. Again, just kidding. Be careful if you do that. And as soon as it gets almost to a boil, add the beurre manier. Translate hand butter means half and half, exactly. So if you have a cup of flour, you get a cup of butter. You want to be careful. I'll take this back from the fire now. You can always add, but you can never take away. Its consistency is perfect because one thing what it's going to get is a whole lot of cream. And then it gets the shrimp. Shrimp goes in the spider. The shrimp, you can leave them whole or you can chop them quickly. White wine. Okay, now, heavy cream, that's all it is. I put in the shrimp, more heavy cream. As I said, I love heavy cream. I'll give it one spin of pepper. Let me see here. Oh, it needs absolutely nothing. Amazing. If you could get the flavor of that, it's unreal. Some beautiful chives. First course for my extraordinary bourbon menu is ready. My fantastic shrimp bisque, deglazed with bourbon. In my opinion, it cannot get better than that. Let's go to Louisville, Kentucky and learn more about the history of bourbon, America's spirit.
When somebody asks me what the bourbon capital of the United States is, of course I'm going to say Kentucky. I'm a little partisan there, but 95% of the bourbon in the United States or in the world is made in Kentucky, so I think we can claim that crown very easily.
Although all bourbon is whiskey, not all whiskey is bourbon. To be considered America's native spirit, all bourbon must be produced in the United States of America and be comprised of at least 51% corn. Among other strict federal regulations, the distilled spirit must be aged in new charred oak barrels every time, with no artificial coloring or flavor additives.
The government does prescribe that bourbon has to be made in the United States, and that has a lot to do with trade agreements and other spirits, for example, like Scotch can only be made in Scotland, tequila in Mexico. So we honor those trade agreements, and then they honor ours to preserve the integrity of bourbon around the world.
The story of bourbon can be traced back as far as the American colonies. European immigrants who settled and farmed the American South took their knowledge of distilling from their homeland and applied it in the New World. Native resources like corn were abundant and reliable, making distilling grain spirits like whiskey a common practice among farmers and entrepreneurs. In fact, in the late 1700s, George Washington operated the nation's largest distillery at his home in Virginia following his term as the nation's first president. Over the years, more Americans moved into the Ohio River Valley, where the climate and crops were best for producing whiskey.
The seasons in Kentucky are perfect for bourbon. The water is perfect for bourbon. It's very mineral rich, limestone water.
The Louisiana Purchase opened up new transportation routes from the Mississippi River all the way to the port of New Orleans, which meant new markets for farmers on the western frontier. Kentucky's fertile soil, seasonal climatic changes, and access to countless waterways paved the way to becoming the nation's hub of bourbon production. Although the origins of the name bourbon has many theories, a common notion revolves around the sale of whiskey on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Some historians believe that French settlers in the city were looking for a cheap and tasty substitute for their native liquor, cognac. Whiskey assumed that role, and demand caught on for the whiskey sold on Bourbon Street. By the early 19th century, advertisements for bourbon began to appear throughout the country, and in 1964, Congress declared bourbon a distinctive product of the United States.
Now comes one of my favorite dishes, which is pork tenderloin. So what I've done is I marinated them overnight in the refrigerator, just peppercorn, bourbon, and a little bit of oil. Now, as you know, never put salt in the marinade, so I'm going to salt a little bit now. Not too much, a little bit. And then I have a Dutchie behind me, getting nice and hot. Put oil in there, that's what I need, perfect. So all I'm going to do now is sear them really good on both sides. Put the pot right next to the fire, so it keeps on cooking gently. Oh, the flavor of the bourbon and the peppercorns, unbelievable. They don't take long at all to cook. I recommend pork should be eaten at 135 inner temperature. So the pork tenderloins are seared off just the way I want them. I'm going to take them off the fire right now, and I'm going to keep them close to the fire. Perfectly cooking while we get into the next dish, which is the sweet and sour red cabbage. What makes it unique? It's different from the German red cabbage, that we keep it somewhat al dente. You want to make sure you take the core out, as I did, because the core will stay hard. That's it. Now what I gotta do quick, I gotta chop some shallots quickly. And we're ready to go. Just getting the butter into it, make sure it's hot enough. Shallots, no color, cabbage, red wine, ready for the sugar? Balsamic vinegar, therefore the name sweet and sour. Okay. My red cabbage is absolutely looking good. Salt and pepper, set it next to the fire. And we're gonna lid it. Next is the bourbon-glazed Granny Smith. Now, you can use any apple you like. I happen to like Granny Smith because they're tart. So all we're gonna do there is we're gonna cut. And I bought some lemon along. The lemon is there just to stop the apples from changing color or oxidizing. The Dutchie is getting hot, and you notice I'm using just powder today. Skin of the apple on top. We're going to deglaze it, so be very careful, because again, you could get some flames. Maybe 5 minutes and they get golden brown. You want the apple to caramelize on the bottom. All right, take it off the fire, lid it, and let it sit there. There are countless bourbon distilleries in Kentucky. Here in Louisville, I found one that's very intriguing, Angel's Envy. Let's go and check it out.
When we're making a whiskey, the first thing you want to do is have a really good source for your raw materials. In our case, that's going to be our water and our 3 predominant grains that go into our bourbon. In our case, we're using about 72% corn. We also use 18% rye and 10% malted barley for our full mash bill. That rye is going to contribute a little bit of spice and a little bit of earthiness to the whiskey. Malted barley is very, very important to the whiskey making process. That barley has an enzyme called amylase. That amylase enzyme will take all the starches out of the rye and the corn, and that enzyme will break that starch down into simpler sugars that the yeast can use to make alcohol during fermentation.
What a lot of flavor.
After about 3 to 5 days, depending on how long we're fermenting, we'll have beer. And it really is beer, it's just water, yeast, and grains. We will distill that, and that will yield us about 40 barrels worth of new make whiskey.
We're gonna pull off some spirits at 138 proof. You'll be surprised when you drink it, even though it's 138 proof, it's not as hot as you might expect it to be. It's a little softer.
Remarkable flavor out of there, the nose. I mean, I can pick up the ingredients. I would have never expected it, you know? Beautiful. You're gonna carry me home?
We age our whiskey at least 4 years. One of the reasons that bourbon is predominantly made in Kentucky, it's because of the climates and the season changes. When you have whiskey or any spirit in a barrel, the only way to get a lot of the flavor out of the wood is for your whiskey to penetrate that wood. The best way to do that is temperature change. So when that whiskey heats up, it'll soak into the wood. And when the whiskey cools down, say in the winter when it's 20 or 30 degrees outside, it'll extract itself from the wood, pulling a lot of the extractable compounds in the wood with it. So you're gonna get a lot of color, you get a lot of flavor.
As one of the few families that's blessed with the ability to make bourbon, it was very important for us to honor the history of bourbon, and also to be innovative and be creative. That's really where the port barrel finish came into play.
All of our whiskeys are finished. And what that means is after the initial aging process, we place it into a second barrel. Our bourbon whiskey is finished in a port wine barrel for about 6 months. That port wine is gonna lend some fruitiness, a little bit of sweetness. We still wanna balance that port finish with the traditional characteristics you get from a bourbon.
But it's so smooth. Vanilla for sure, but I also pick up raisin.
A lot of honey, like almost clover honey and a little bit of nuttiness. It's really, really interesting.
Tasting is a journey. You can sit out in a tasting and you can pick out so many different things just from sip to sip. And that's one of the things that's really cool about bourbon as opposed to other spirits is that there's so much to discover in that glass.
And that's why I always say there's no right, no wrong. Whatever you decide is good, as long as you drink it, right?
Absolutely. And Dad used to say that. He doesn't care how you drink it as long as you drink it.
That's my kind of guy.
Absolutely.
When I conceptualized this menu today in tribute of the great American spirit bourbon, I thought I'd maybe finish it with one of my favorite dishes, and it's a galette. What a galette is, basically, you can consider it a fritter. If you're able to get white corn, like I'm having today here, you don't want to blanch it at all. All you really want to do is cut it, like so. And what's unique about this fritter, or the galette, is the sweetness of the corn. Here we go. Some flour in my bowl, a little bit of baking powder, not too much, just a little bit so they can rise. Eggs. I want to mix it up first and make sure. Then I add some, whether you can use milk or heavy cream. Mix this really good. Put a little bit of water in there. Remember, like I always tell you, add on slowly. If you put too much liquid in there, then you have to add more flour. Nutmeg. I don't think we have any dish that doesn't use nutmeg. Okay, now I put a bit of corn in it. Okay, now the bacon, so it gives a unique flavor. The bacon bits I already pre-cooked, because if I wouldn't pre-cook them, they wouldn't be cooked enough by the time the galette is cooked. Now it just needs a little bit of salt, chives. Put my griddle on the fire. 18th century pancake griddle, if you believe it or not, because they did a lot of fritters and French toast and shrimp toast and many items like that, which are done cooked on the open fire in this particular device behind me, which not easy to come by. So now what I want to do, trying to make them unorthodox. We want to cook them slowly, not too much heat at one time, so they can crisp up nicely. If you make it too hot, then the galette will be raw inside. You don't want that. Oh, you're in for a treat. Oh, that will taste unbelievable together with the red cabbage, I'm telling you. So we're gonna finish up this feast. Oof, that smells good. Okay, red cabbage here. Red cabbage with the caramelized bourbon-glazed Granny Smith. So this is my final platter, the pork marinated bourbon and peppercorn tenderloin that I'm slicing up and serving it, and a little bit of green beans with cremini mushrooms. perfectly cooked. Absolutely spectacular. Oh, the bourbon comes right through the flavor of this pork tenderloin. Just amazing. Diana, so glad to have you here. Diana is my pastry chef in the City Tavern. Why did you come up with this dessert after my bourbon-infused menu?
Well, you said bourbon, and I couldn't think of anything else. It is my go-to at City Tavern.
Bourbon pecan pie.
Kentucky bourbon. There was no other choice. So I have this lovely pâte sucrée made.
Pâte sucrée, yeah.
It's very, very similar to just a shortbread dough. So it's been chilling, and now you can see it's nice and pliable.
Yeah.
So I buttered this, and I have lots of flour on the table so that it makes it non-stick inside the pan. And just want to roll it out, continually turning so that you keep a nice circular shape. A 1/4 inch or thinner. I wouldn't go too much thicker than that. Check for size. Looks pretty good. So just roll your pie dough. And then line up your edge and roll it very gently and carefully right into your pan. Beautiful, works every time. And pressing it down into the bottom of the pan. Gotta go all the way around. Fastest way to trim the edge, go straight across, just like that. And this just prevents any large air bubbles from coming up and therefore dispersing your custard. Okay, so this is the part where the blind baking really comes in because we're gonna completely cover it. So now we are blind to what's happening in there. And you can use a plate, which works really nice, which will keep all of the dough flat and even. I'm gonna chuck it in the oven. I do it in 2 steps. I put it in this way for about 15 minutes, then take the paper and the plate off, throw it back in just until the bottom starts to brown. Here we are, chefs. You can see there's just a little bit of color, but it is fully baked. So I'm going to move it over there to completely cool, and we'll make the filling while that cools. So this one is very, very simple. It starts with 3 eggs.
Whisk them out.
Break these up just a little bit, and then we have 2 kinds of sugar going in here. Just some granulated sugar all at once.
And
We have some corn syrup, all of that goodness out. Oh, there you go. Little skin on top. Give that a good whisk. Now this mixture, you do not want to leave alone for too long, otherwise your eggs will scramble with all that sugar in there. So a little bit of salt, just a pinch. Vanilla extract, delicious. And if you would help me out there with a good, healthy splash of bourbon. Oh yes, oh it smells so good.
oh, smell it.
Oh yes. Last ingredient is just a little bit of melted butter. I've got some hot. I'm just gonna grab it with my ladle and bring it over. And can you believe the custard is that simple?
Well, that's why it's your standby dessert.
That's right, that's right. It's too easy. These are just chopped pecans, and then we have our beautiful halves here as well. So I like to start with the chopped on the bottom. So we've got lots of good toasted nuts in the bottom, and start to pour over the top. And I'm just gonna get it to the point where the nuts are barely covered. I'm gonna save a little bit of custard for the top. And this is why it's so important to blind bake, because this custard is just so thin. We'll just arrange these in a lovely fashion. You can get as creative as you want here, but I like a nice concentric circle, draws the eye in, and is quite recognizable. So now we're just gonna fill the rest of the way, making sure we don't go over the edge into the tart pan, otherwise you'll never get it out. This custard is very sticky.
But this gives you the beautiful glaze when it comes out.
That's right. So this one at 325 degrees will only take about 20 minutes. And there we have it. Oh, I just love it. The smell, the lovely glistening
And
top.
what's interesting, it still smells the bourbon.
Yes,
Let's see if it matches the looks with the taste.
there we have it. You can see
Gooey.
how the chopped nuts at the bottom have
see.
really taken to the custard and turned into one, which is just
Beautiful.
my favorite part.
Wow. No wonder everybody's crazy about it. Isn't it awesome? Even you are speechless. Thanks, Diana, for helping me conclude this great episode on bourbon, a true American spirit, all for a taste of history.
A Taste of History is made possible by Sandals Resorts, the luxury included vacation.
For the past 10 years, I've gotten so many requests for recipes for my show, A Taste of History. Well, now you can find my favorite recipes in the Taste of History cookbook.